At the end of the Great War, most countries around the world were reeling and trying to figure out how to get back to life like it was before the war. In the United States, that meant that we were ready to return to what many called normalcy. And in this case, it meant returning to our isolationist policies. In fact, this was very evident when you look at how Warren G. Harding wins his election in 1920 with the campaign of return to normalcy, meaning he wanted to return to those isolationist policies and those times like were before World War One. There are many clear examples of how badly the United States wanted to return to these isolationist policies. In what were called the Washington Naval Conferences, this was going to be where many countries around the world all came together to discuss disarmament. Just like an arms race is the building up of weapons, in this case, disarmament means it was these countries proposing that they decrease the size of their militaries and to decrease the number of weapons that they had. This was one example of how we really want to ease the tension that had been built up during World War One. The Kellogg-Briand Treaty or Kellogg-Briand Pact was signed in 1929, another very clear example of how badly we wanted to avoid war. In fact, this actually attempted to outlaw war. The problem with this pact was that there was simply no enforcement. How could you possibly enforce a pact that says you can't go to war? There is no real recourse to keep them from countries from going to war. But the fact that these countries signed this shows just how desperately everyone was to avoid another war. Another example of our isolationist policies are that we are going to return a very high tariff. Remember, a tariff is a tax on imports. If we raise a high tariff, then other countries are also going to raise high tariffs, which is going to decrease international trade. By decreasing international trade, that is not going to continue to encourage our countries to work together, but encourage them to isolate one another. Again, another example of how desperately we wanted to return to our isolationism. Unfortunately, this also leads to more nativism. Remember, nativism is going to be where you are going to favor your native born Americans over immigrants. So we see once again in the United States this rise of anti immigrant sentiment or feelings in the United States. We're going to establish discriminatory quota systems, meaning we're only going to allow immigrants in larger numbers from countries we liked and smaller numbers from countries we didn't like. And the example of this is the National Origins Act that was passed in 1921. Again, we were targeting specific countries in order to keep immigrants from countries out that we didn't like. We also see this as a major time of the labor unions having a lot of unrest. Working conditions were still very poor. The cost of most goods during a war are going to rise. That's inflation. So during World War One, the cost of goods went up, but workers' wages were not rising to meet that. And again, where they are also facing technological unemployment, meaning that machines were taking their jobs. But during a war, it was not okay for these workers to go on strike. So they kind of held off during wartime. After the war is over, it is now time for them to abandon that and begin fighting for their rights again. So we see various strikes throughout the United States and organizations like our police force in Boston. Again, you probably don't want your police to go on strike. A steel strike and coal miners are all going to strike. Unfortunately, in the 1920s, for these labor unions, our labor union system is going to weaken. The open shop system was adopted throughout many states, meaning that employees were not required to join a labor union to work there. This is going to make it so that laborers or your workers had a choice and were often encouraged by management to not join that labor union. We also see businesses adopting what's called welfare capitalism. Welfare capitalism is where your business owners are going to provide certain welfare services to their employees, basically trying to help them out so that they were seen as being good employers and that employers who were willing to help their workers so that they wouldn't turn to a labor union. So we see that overall system weaken. We also begin to see that labor unions begin to be associated with communism. One of the big reasons that they were associated with communists are because many of these workers are going to be immigrants, and many of these immigrants are poor, and many of them are going to be fighting for more fair treatment. And for them, communism, while it won't allow anyone to be wealthy, it would certainly prevent them from being poor. So the United States is going to enter a time period where we become very fearful of anything related to communism, especially after the success of the Russian Revolution in 1917, led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks in Russia. This is going to turn them into a communist system. So the communists and the Bolsheviks are going to lead that revolution in Russia. They were successful in turning it into a communist system. And one of the basic premises of communism is that this is something that will not be contained, that it will eventually lead to a worldwide revolution. And you can imagine why our industrialists and wealthy people in America were not interested in a worldwide revolution against them. So we enter a period in the United States called the Red Scare. Now, there are two Red Scares in American history. The first one is in the 1920s. This is after the formation of the U.S. Communist Party and the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. Remember, that was led by Eugene V. Debs. And this is when we are basically very suspicious on any socialist or anyone who either helped communists or who tended to lean toward communist ideals. We did not want to allow anyone to entertain the idea of turning to communism because communism was so very, very different from capitalism. We are so desperate to root out any communists, we were willing to do just about anything. The Palmer raids were led by a man named A. Mitchell Palmer and J. Edgar Hoover. These two men are going to lead raids against mostly immigrants where many of their basic civil liberties were violated in an attempt to run them out of the United States. Many immigrants were deported as a result of these Palmer raids, and they were targeted for their political beliefs and then sent away from the United States to try to prevent the spread of further communist ideas. Many of these immigrants believed it was simply because they were immigrants that they were targeted. An example of some unfair treatment to immigrants is going to be Sacco and Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti were anarchists who were also immigrants who were accused of robbing and murdering a security guard that was delivering some payroll to a factory. There were very few witnesses to this crime. In fact, the only witnesses that they had talked about being down a dark alley and talked about two dark haired gentlemen. One of these two gentlemen were actually had an alibi in another town at the time of the crime. The judge who presided over the trial even made some racist remarks against these two gentlemen. In what was clearly an unfair trial, these two radicals and immigrants are going to be convicted and later executed for this crime. The Ku Klux Klan is going to see record membership in the 1920s. Mostly because while the Ku Klux Klan or the KKK is mostly known for their dislike of African Americans, the Ku Klux Klan dislikes anyone who is not a white American, basically. They dislike immigrants, they dislike Catholics, they dislike African Americans, anyone who is not in their very narrow view of what it means to be an American. So, one of the reasons that the growth of the Klan is going to happen like it does in the 1920s is because so many people did not like immigrants. Prosperity is going to return in the 1920s. In fact, one of the sayings was that the business of America is business. Everybody seemed to be doing very well, except for farmers, which we will talk about in the next few days. Warren G. Harding is going to make some great appointment choices, uh, like Herbert Hoover, for example. He also makes some that were a little unfortunate, like the Ohio Gang. The Ohio Gang were basically his poker buddies that he brought in to serve in various positions in his cabinet. When he does this, they're going to get him into a lot of trouble and get him involved in all kinds of scandals, like the Teapot Dome scandal. This is where the government owns some very oil rich lands, and you know oil is very valuable. The government is going to lease those lands out to private oil companies for less than their value. And then those government officials who have been appointed by Harding are going to pocket that extra money. When this comes out, it was a huge embarrassment to Warren G. Harding and his administration, was a big, big problem. But Warren G. Harding is going to die in office. After he dies in office, Calvin Coolidge, who was his vice president, is going to replace him, and he will then go on to win re-election. His philosophy of government was, and his slogans were keep cool with Coolidge, and his nickname was Do Nothing Cal because he basically believed in very little regulation and believed in having the hands off the government and allowing it to basically run itself. So you see here the philosophies of these various presidents during the 1920s are going to be very similar to what was before the progressive era in basically allowing businesses to operate with very little regulation.